Welcome to Beat Cancer, the official podcast of the UC Davis Comprehensive Cancer Center. Thanks for joining us today as we have in-depth discussions of the science, research, and advancements taking place at our National Cancer Institute designated Comprehensive Cancer Center. I'm Chris Joyce.
And I'm Stephanie Winn. We will also examine proactive approaches to cancer prevention and, most importantly, how we are breaking barriers to beat cancer in our community and beyond. Joining us today is Dr. Shehnaz Hussain, a molecular epidemiologist and associate director of our population sciences. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Hussain.
Thank you for having me.
Today we are talking about some very exciting research. It's actually drawing a lot of media attention and keeping Dr. Hussain very busy, and that's cancer risks facing firefighters due to wildfire smoke. This is so important, the research that you're doing, Dr. Hussain. Tell us a little more about your new grant.
Sure. So, we're just getting started, quite honestly. We were fortunate enough to receive a grant from the UC Climate Action Initiative. And it's a pretty large team of us here at UC Davis, as well as UCLA, working together on this project. And it's really multifaceted. In one aim, we're really trying to characterize wildfire emissions, to try and understand what the carcinogenic components are. In another aim, we're trying to examine firefighters in their totality, right? So we want to look at any cancer risk factors that exist and what we could potentially mitigate in the future to reduce cancer risk in firefighters. And then we also have a very kind of community engaged aim where we're really trying to develop and promote best practices among firefighters through this video campaign that we're going to be embarking on.
$2 million grant, correct?
Correct. Yes, $2 million over 2 years.
2 years, and some results that you have to produce pretty quickly.
Yes, it is. It's kind of uncomfortable for a researcher to have such a quick turnaround from data collection to dissemination, and in fact, we're charged with really providing actionable outcomes from this grant within 2 years, and so that's what we're targeting.
Well, and because California seems to be on fire quite often, was that something that led you to study the wildfire smoke as it relates to cancer, or were there other factors that played into that as well?
Yeah, so I'd say it was a combination of factors. So it was about a year ago that the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is kind of the cancer arm of the WHO, World Health Organization, deemed firefighting as an occupation to be carcinogenic to humans. And so with that designation, there was certainly a lot of data that was aggregated that, really supported that designation. But what it really highlighted for many of us is that there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge about what the exact exposures are that firefighters are facing, and in particular, the wildfire emissions that we see increasingly here in California. So, that was certainly part of it. Another part of my personal motivation is that, as Steph mentioned, I serve as the Associate Director for Population Sciences in our Comprehensive Cancer Center. And as an NCI designated cancer center, we really, we're tasked to meet pretty much the highest standards of not just clinical care and research, but also cancer prevention. And so we really need to serve our community and kind of the broader public, of our region, and address and respond to their concerns. And so what we've been learning from our community outreach and engagement office in the Cancer Center through these community conversations that they've been conducting across our region is that air pollution and wildfires are of concern, and people really want to know, how is this impacting their cancer risk? So as part of my role as the Associate Director for Population Sciences, I saw a gap and a need to address this research. And then lastly, I'll just say from kind of a personal perspective is that I moved here to Northern California not too long ago, but just in time for a really devastating wildfire called the Camp Fire, which I'm sure many of the listeners are aware of, which erupted in the town of Paradise, just adjacent to where I was living in Chico. And, as we were kind of living through being blanketed with the smoke and the various fire debris, I couldn't help but question, obviously intuitively, I felt this was bad for our health, bad for my family's health, but really there was limited data on what the actual health risks were associated with this debris that was resulting from a wildfire, not just a wildfire, but a fire burning in the wildland-urban interface. So a lot of built structure as well as wildland fuels kind of coming together. So so I'd say it's kind of a combination of all of that that's led me down this road.
Because, as we're recording this right now, we're heading into the winter-ish time that we have in Sacramento, which we all know is not really winter, but it's cooler. And so people begin to start lighting fires in their fireplaces. And you mentioned just some of the urban smoke. Do fireplace fires, do they contribute to the same type of risks that the wildfires do, just on a smaller scale, or are they not? Do they not make an impact?
So certainly there is particulate matter that's released anytime we burn fuels, even in your own fireplace or wood burning stove. But I think what's of increasing concern to many of us are the unknown components of the fuels when fires burn built structures. So, we know that buildings contain a lot of known carcinogens in their structures, right? There's asbestos, there's heavy metals, benzene, formaldehyde. There's all these things that kind of are now getting released into our atmosphere and that we are taking in through the air and through other exposures. And so really that's, I think, what is of increasing concern for the fires that are burning here in California.
And what is the climate piece in all of this, Dr. Hussain? Is it the behavior of the wildfires that we're seeing that contributes to this cancer risk in firefighters as well as potentially other populations?
Yeah, so I think it's a lot of things coming together. I think that certainly there is an increase. It's about the inhabiting these wildland-urban interfaces that's increasing in California. So these zones, called these WUI zones, are more and more being inhabited by humans. And so that's putting a lot of us at risk for kind of that frontline exposure. And for our firefighters, of course, that means that there's a lot more activity that's required to take place at those wildland-urban interfaces to save human life and structures. And so that's part of kind of the climate-related increases that we're seeing in fires. But of course, the droughts that we've experienced this year. We had a very wet year last year, and the prediction is actually that probably what's happening is we have now an increase in vegetation that is available for fuel for some of the wildfires that may come down the road, and so we're really just not immune in this kind of changing climate that we're living in, where we have droughts. As well as excessive wet years like we saw last year.
And I've heard you make the point, too, that the firefighters that are fighting a lot of these wildland fires are not wearing the type of protective gear that a lot of our urban firefighters are wearing. And you're taking a look at that as well?
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's really wildland firefighters have to be nimble, right? They have to be able to kind of move about quickly, and the type of job tasks that they're doing often requires that, they can't carry oxygen tanks and wear heavy respiratory equipment. And so often, all they're wearing is maybe a thin layer of cloth to cover their respiratory tract. And so, so that is a concern, of course, because probably most of the carcinogenic exposures are coming through inhalation.
Well, what type of cancers are we seeing or that are attributed to all of this this increased smoke inhalation? Not only by the firefighters who are out there with not as efficient protective gear, but then also just residents of the surrounding areas.
Right, absolutely. So, while the literature is still pretty sparse, it's definitely growing. And so I'd say it's growing in evidence largely at the population level that wildfire smoke is not just associated with increased cancer risk, but also cancer progression and potentially treatment response for individuals who have a diagnosis of cancer and are undergoing treatment. And so probably the most widely studied component of wildfire smoke in relation to cancer is PM2.5. And so that's a mixture of particulate matter that is of a certain size. It's 2.5 microns or smaller. That's smaller in diameter than a red blood cell. So small, fine particulate matter that can kind of get deep into the lungs, into the size of a capillary, really. And so it's this PM2.5 that's been examined kind of at this population level and has been associated with increased risk of a lot of different cancers. So lung cancer is probably primarily where we have the greatest evidence, but also gastrointestinal cancers, urinary tract cancer, so bladder cancer, kidney cancer, pancreatic cancer even has been associated with PM2.5. And so while some of that is not necessarily specific to wildfire smoke, it's kind of general air pollution. There's really, ample evidence to believe that wildfire PM2.5 would have the same associations. It's just that the evidence of being able to attribute these exposures specifically to wildfires is still growing.
And I'm a young firefighter. I'm facing these risks, cancer being a leading cause of death for firefighters. What advice do you have for firefighters out there?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of best practices that are widely published by a lot of different organizations, fire advocacy organizations, and within the firefighting organizations themselves. And so I think just adhering as best as possible to those best practices, which shower within the hour, not storing PPE in places where you reside or within the cab of your truck or your car. So these sorts of things to reduce exposure. But then also, we do have strong evidence that for certain cancers, early detection is really key to mitigating the worst effects of the cancer. And so where there are published cancer screening guidelines, I think it's imperative that all of us, and particularly firefighters who we know are at increased risk of cancer, really adhere to those best practices for cancer screening. Are
there areas or geographies of the state that are more, that the residents or the firefighters are more prone to be adversely affected by the smoke? Yeah, so, I would say it doesn't really appear that any part of our state is immune to the impacts of wildfire smoke. I mean, we've seen this over and over again, that these wildfire smoke plumes can travel hundreds and hundreds of miles from the source. And so really, there is really no immunity based on geography.
Well, tell us more about how you're conducting your research, and, you taking blood samples. What are you doing to sort of track the the danger levels out there?
Yeah, so I can describe kind of the firefighter cohort that we're building currently, which is part of that is to understand the exposures that they're experiencing at the fire front. But other parts of that study are really to examine other risk factors, lifestyle and behavioral factors that are kind of general occupational hazards of being a firefighter that we know associate with increased cancer risk. So one of those is sleep disruption. So, we know that circadian disruptions are associated with increased cancer risk. Certainly firefighters are not immune to that, and really kind of grapple with these challenges and sleep patterns. And so we plan on studying that over the course of a year in each of our enrolled firefighter participants by monitoring their sleep and activity. Other things include stress. So, stress is another important factor that is an occupational hazard for firefighters, and we know it relates to cancer risk. And so we have various tools and measures that we're going to use to kind of associate different measures of stress with, other occupational exposures and practices, so that in the end, what we're really trying to do is understand these various risk factors and relate them to biomarkers that we're going to be measuring in the blood at multiple time points in these firefighters. So certainly we don't plan on studying these firefighters, enrolling them now, and being able to understand impact on cancer as an outcome. But we can look at various biomarkers that we know are associated with increased risk of cancer. So these are changes in DNA, methylation, for example, immune biomarkers that relate to all of the risk factors I mentioned that we know can promote cancer development. So by understanding how these exposures relate to these biomarkers, we can then kind of identify those that are going to place firefighters at the highest risk and then work towards interventions to reduce those risks.
How are you choosing participants, or how are participants being selected?
Yeah, so there's really no selection process per se. Really, any career firefighter within our region in California is eligible to enroll because we're doing a lot of kind of semi-intensive study visits that require blood draws and some body composition analysis and several surveys. Our approach is actually to work with fire chiefs and actually go to the fire stations that welcome us to conduct the research there, so that it's really kind of the least bit burdensome for the firefighters and for the activities of the fire station, so that they can kind of continue on with business as usual, and we can kind of get our study assessments done while we can.
Are you doing an open call still? Are you still looking for participants, or have you reached the capacity for that? Now you're just continuing with the study itself?
No. We are still enrolling, and so we are kind of actively engaging with fire chiefs in Sacramento City and Sacramento Metro fire stations that we're going to be working to set up kind of our recruitment days within their fire stations. And so if there are any fire chiefs out there listening that would like to bring this research into their fire station, they can certainly reach out to us.
Perfect. We will make sure that we add contact information in the description so that any interested firefighters or chiefs can access that and then get in contact with you. Do you have any findings in your studies that you might be able to share with us now, or are we still in very early days so that you're just more in the collection, the data collection phase?
Yeah, so with the firefighter cohort, we're certainly in the early days. we have embarked on some different strategies to try to characterize the cancer risks associated with wildfires in California. So, and this was made possible through funding by our Comprehensive Cancer Center about a year ago. And so one of the studies that we're doing is actually linking a data set of PM 2.5 exposures across the entire state. So it's modeled data for wildfire-specific PM 2.5 that has come out of our UC Davis Air Quality Research Center, and mainly been made available through our collaborator Sean Rafuse. And the way he's generated this data is really to merge diverse data sources, which include kind of the official air quality monitoring data available in the state, satellite observations, various meteorological models, and really kind of cleverly these low-cost sensors like Purple Air, for example, that can kind of merge all this data together to produce what we consider kind of our best guess estimate of PM 2.5 concentrations at specific geographic locations across the state. So we've taken this data set and we've linked it to all cancers diagnosed in the state of California from 2017 to 2020. And so we're looking at this data set and we plan on asking several different research questions. And the first question that we're addressing is, does wildfire PM 2.5 exposure relate to stage at cancer diagnosis? So is there something about having this exposure in proximity to your cancer diagnosis? Does that influence possibly the aggressiveness of your cancer? So that's the initial question that we started to look at. And the cancer that we've chosen to initially look at is lung cancer. And so we have found that there is quite a significant association. So individuals with a higher stage of lung cancer, so like a stage 4 diagnosis of lung cancer, had higher PM 2.5 exposure in the 1 month preceding their cancer diagnosis compared to those with lesser stage, like a stage 1, stage 2, or stage 3 cancer diagnosis. So we're going to kind of continue along this line of inquiry and look at other wildfire or other PM 2.5 associated cancers to see if we can find signals for those cancer sites as well.
Well, Winn, you had mentioned that you work with the community, our Office of Community Outreach and Engagement. Do you anticipate using some of the findings to help educate the public or to help even influence behaviors, or at least informing the general public on what they can do to reduce their risks should there be wildfires happening around them in the future? Do you anticipate using that for your research findings for that as well? Or is it mainly to help just focus on the firefighters and the way that it affects cancer or increases just the risk of getting cancer within firefighters?
Yeah, no, so that's a good question. And I think our ultimate goal here is really to understand what the impacts are on the entire community at large, right? And so looking at firefighters, I mean, we just know that their exposures are so much stronger and so much more acute that if we find signals there, we can certainly imagine that these are going to exist at the population level as well. And so, it kind of depends on what our research question is. The studies where we're looking at PM 2.5 in those diagnosed with cancer, if we find significant associations, I think that it's important information to empower cancer patients themselves that they may be at increased risk of adverse health effects if they are exposed to high levels of PM 2.5, say during their treatment phases, for example. So we certainly want to arrive at information that can help to inform cancer patients, our community at large, as well as policymakers that can, help to improve on protections within our community and for specific classes of occupation that really have no choice but to endure these high risks and these exposures.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Hussain, is there anything else that we missed that maybe you'd like to bring to our attention or that you'd like to touch upon?
Yeah. I would just like to acknowledge that this is certainly a team effort, and I'm really honored and privileged to be leading this work with a really talented group of investigators here at UC Davis, as well as my co-PI at UCLA, Derek Irwin, who is himself a career firefighter and also an assistant professor in chemistry. And so we have a lot of expertise on our team from, environmental engineers to exposure scientists to behavioral scientists. And it really kind of takes this kind of collaborative, multidisciplinary work, I think, to address this question. To address this important research question.
We appreciate all the great work you're doing.
Outstanding. Well, Dr. Hussain, thank you.
Thank you guys for having me. This has been fun.
Thank you for tuning in and listening today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at beatcancer@ucdavis.edu. Beat Cancer is a production of the UC Davis Comprehensive Cancer Center. For more information on our NCI-designated Comprehensive Cancer Center, please visit health.ucdavis.edu/cancer.